Have you ever wondered why your favorite taco is costing you an arm and a leg these days? Or is your dream couch still on backorder for months now? Join us as we go behind the scenes of the global supply chain. Let us discuss, understand its complexity, and learn from industry leaders, professionals, and subject matter experts. Expect in-depth analysis and genuine conversations about the major issues affecting the supply chain today. Welcome to Supply Chain Demystified. Your host is none other than distinguished supply chain expert, Dr. Nick Vyas. Professor Vyas is the academic director of USC Marshall's Global Supply Chain Management and the founding executive director of USC Marshall Randall R. Kendrick Global Supply Chain Institute.
Ambassador Garcetti, thanks for joining on my podcast, Supply Chain Demystified. It's such an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you, Nick, for so many years of friendship and leadership, not just here at USC, but for our city and our world.
Appreciate you being here. So let's jump right in it. As you know, the title of the podcast, Supply Chain Demystified. I think supply chain used to be sort of a backdrop. Only time person knew supply chain was such a thing is something broke. Well, 2020, we had a pandemic of the century, COVID-19, that made us realize as a civilization that supply chain is the artery that drives not only the global economy, but everything, the way we live, the way we consume, the way we move around, everything underpins by global supply chain management. So let's use that as a reference point. What do you think since the outbreak of COVID, the recognition of importance of supply chain and where we are today?
Well, supply chain is certainly sexy now in a way that it wasn't. I think people heard it as one of those words or terms like infrastructure that they knew was important but weren't quite sure how to define. And it's either through crisis or opportunity that sometimes we find just how important these forces are, almost like the laws of physics govern the universe. It's certainly the laws and the art as well of logistics that really define modern life. And it was in that crisis moment when the world suddenly lived through a pandemic. By the way, a pandemic and a moment we kind of forget happened because it was so traumatizing in many ways. We pretend like that never happened. But it exposed for us how dependent we are on the complexity that has allowed us some amazing things, like to one-click culture, get anything from almost anywhere more quickly than any human beings ever have. But on the flip side, at moments of crisis, whether it's war or pandemics, what those choke points are and how fragile the existing system is. As beautiful as it is, it's also a fragile system. And I think people started asking those questions, why do masks suddenly cost $10 when they could be 40 cents just 3 months earlier? What do we need to do to make sure that we have supply of the basics to survive in a moment? And because of that, I think we now see.
So obviously the pandemic of the century, we went through 156 countries out of 188, came to absolute halt, right? Supply side disruption eventually led to the demand side disruptions, and we were in the mess and we thought this was it. But somehow we made it through. Tell me your perspective. How did you see the world of supply chain during those crisis points?
Well, I think we went from the world of magic to the world of art and science. Magic because we just thought these things magically appeared. These beautifully manufactured phones with microprocessors smaller than we could even imagine that govern our life and take up hours of our day. The way we could get goods that we never thought of, genius inventions that go from an idea to a product in days sometimes, fashion that changes on the dime but that you can get right away. That was in this bucket of magic. And then suddenly we realized that there's actually a science to this, that there are factories in foreign places and sometimes domestic places that make things still. There are the transportation networks that actually take them across oceans or over air. And then the art of it wasn't just dictated by science. At moments like the pandemic, we had to figure out how do these things actually land in crisis and how are they changing? The idea of things being just in time might bring down the price, but it also means at times when we actually need them, they're just not there. And so for us, as a mayor, it was very interesting because many mayors don't control ports or airports. They're port authorities or states that govern them. Here in Los Angeles, being mayor of Los Angeles is a unique position because the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere, and at the time, the third busiest airport, and the number one airport of origination and destination, in other words, where flights begin and end, is here in Los Angeles. And so to be a decent mayor, I had to not only take care of the people here, but the people across America and North America that depend on the port of LA, and all the visitors, investors, and even travelers who are coming through LA who depend on the airport. And so I became a real student of logistics, a student of trying to find the good people who could run those entities, and looking at what do we have to do to stay ahead of this as it changes. And these stress tests that we went through in COVID, or economic downturn or war, I think are really important for us to build an even better system than what we have today, and a more just system for everybody who's connected to it.
Yeah. So I mean, you and I go back 2 decades, from the days of the city council members to mayors, being an ambassador, which was an incredible milestone. You have been a global person. You traveled globally. You had a great sense of appreciation being global. 2013, I was the first one to write Decouplings of Supply Chain Without Deglobalization. And then the idea for which we created this hypothesis is that during the time that I spent in Asia, that we had become way too dependent on one single country, what I call the single node of manufacturing. In this case, China became the world's biggest factory. Goods were moving in through single node, and our grandparents would always tell, don't put all your eggs in the one basket, just in case you trip over, right? So the premise for which we wrote this article and took this thought leadership as a discussion point way before the COVID. I had no foresight of COVID happening in 2020.
Because if you did, you'd tell us all.
I would have said that in 2013.
It wasn't Nick's fault. I just want everybody listening to this to know that. Okay.
Exactly. So, I mean, you look at it from the global standpoint. I mean, there is such a sentiment today that looks like that we want to sort of get away from the globalized model and become more either regional or country specific. What is your sense? Why are we thinking from that dimensions, and what is an outlook? What would that look like?
So I think you're exactly right, and you were ahead of the game in seeing that. And it's a return to the way international relations have kind of focused on national interests over values. And it's such an interesting moment we live through, because certainly here in the US, we had a bipartisan consensus pro-globalization from really Ronald Reagan to George H.W. Bush to the administrations of Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and then suddenly Trump won, then Biden also, and now Trump too, as an era that turned away from that I think reflected the voice of a lot of losers of globalization that were promised, prosperity, but instead had plant closures, and the opioids followed, and the health concerns and the poverty in places that used to be a place where you didn't need a university degree to support your family. And not just in the US, but other places, there were winners and losers, and people who were the losers felt like, well, globalization might be good for the folks at the top who are earning money. You can tell me abstractly it's good for efficiency and the economy, but if I don't feel it where I live, there's a backlash. Second, so that's the economic piece. Second is the security piece. A lot of nations realized, well, if we just depend on a free market around the world, and it's over-concentrated in one place, whether it's rare earth metals, whether it's electronics, whether it's even consumer goods. Look at the war right now, energy. The moment something goes wrong and a country wants to manipulate that, or war or other effects begin to change that, we pay the security price of not being able to even feed our people, arm our army, get our Navy ships across the world, et cetera. And so I think it's both the economic and the security arguments that have changed that. And the third thing is the changing technology. Now there's an opening. It might have been nice abstractly to say, well, let's bring it all back. Well, certain things are never going to be built as cheaply in countries like the United States as in other places. But we can either, one, find allies, my work in India, There was a real closeness about maybe India could be a place of scale to counterbalance some of China's excellence, but also dominance, and have that shared so that security-wise we have options. Could be even closer in Mexico because we have, the agreements that allow us to cross borders, at least then a little bit more fluidly. But maybe we can even bring it home now because the high-end manufacturing and even some of the low-end manufacturing may not depend as much on labor, which is a sad thing for jobs, but it may mean that in this next 20, 25 years, some of that can be produced in any country at basically the same cost. And why not do it locally instead of, it's reducing pollution, it's reducing risk, and it might be even reducing price.
So it's interesting, right? So when we think about this bringing home from purely the economic standpoint, simply we cannot be in the business of making widgets. There are no economics can justify, and companies will not invest in the country of such a high cost of labor and infrastructure and so forth to justify that. But let's talk about the advanced manufacturing, right? So we suddenly have chips, defense, semiconductors, batteries. Uh, do you think we had lost sort of a foresight of not actually maintaining some competitive advantage and edge? You mentioned rare earth mineral today. China has 96% capacity to process the rare earth mineral. It's now down to 84, right? Significantly lower over the last 13, 14 months. Uh, is there policy decision that can help us stay globalized as well as maintain some of these critical aspects of the supply chain close to home or at home, but still be invested across the world? Because we're the promoter of the global economy. Our country's foundation was open market, fair competition. Do we continue to stay with that mindset?
I do believe that even low labor, low wage manufacturing may be cheap enough through automation to reshore. But certainly the high end stuff is critical to our security. And it's not just the competition between nations, it's the competition between the different nodes that want this technology, rare earths. For instance, we might be deciding at a time when we see our entire arsenal militarily be depleted very quickly in a conflict, a war like in Iran, that the rare earth minerals that are being released from China, we can either put into iPhones, or we can put them into data centers, or we can put them into Tomahawk missiles. And what's the choice? Are you a secure country if you don't have access to that, because so much of weaponry now is dependent on that in high tech? So we're gonna have to make decisions and bring that here. Second, we're gonna have to make decisions if we do bring it back. It's not rocket science to do this stuff, but it takes 10, 15 years. You have to have the workforce who knows how to work in smelters. You have to pass that knowledge on, and we didn't tend to that, so we don't have that in place. And then there's environmental costs that maybe China was willing to pay, but are we willing to, because we have higher environmental standards, and thank God we do. But can we suddenly bring that in, bring ore from around the world and put that in somebody's backyard in a smelter where there's always going to be some environmental costs? So there's some big decisions, I think, for us. The best thing to do, in my opinion, is to be able to diversify enough. It's not good even for China, for that over-concentration in China, because China wants a world, I believe, that's secure and not at war. And when, it's what Immanuel Kant talked about with the perpetual peace. He had three aspects of it: Republican governance, that certainly seems to be weakened these days with populism and our social media feeds and algorithms that are taking us to conflict. Second piece was international law. That's being flouted, and certainly no new law written. But that third piece, commerce, when people are tied together in trade, they're much less likely to fight. And so I would argue this isn't just good from an economic standpoint, but finding a way to diversify any sector and making us more mutually dependent is maybe the best guarantor of the conditions of peace.
Absolutely. I often cite this data point, Eric, that close to 2.4 billion people have been uplifted from the extreme poverty to the consuming class. And what does the consuming class mean? So they are actually buying a cup of Starbucks a week, right? They're purchasing a pair of jeans and they're buying new Nike shoes. We created that 2.4 billion people in the consuming class. And ultimately, our corporations, we are participating in that upside of this global economy that we actually created. And so that data point doesn't get talked about it in media, that the rising tide lifts all boats, right? And now if you're a big boat, you may not rise as much, but you're still rising.
Well, and it's important to remember that rising tide swamps some boats. If you were that factory town, so what that a Starbucks is there? You don't have $7, $8 to get the, sweet foam on top of your frappuccino.
Yeah, exactly.
You're feeling that hurt. And so I think it's really important in these discussions about logistics and trade and the system to center people. And there's especially those who are the weakest, the global south, who sometimes has been bypassed. And then within our communities, even the global north, what are the communities that feel bypassed or who have lost? Because it's important to hear that statistic. Not enough people know that statistic, but it's an intellectual point for somebody out of work. They just don't have a job today.
Absolutely. You, Eric, ever since I've known you over 2 decades, you've always been what I call the triple bottom line. At least two of those P's, you've been part of it, people and planet. Your work in sustainability, your work in community building.
You're saying I haven't
And
gotten
I would say profit, I think.
No,
I'm giving
I
you
chose the public sector.
I'm giving you that as a third.
I took public over profit.
Exactly.
That's good.
I think if I were to say, if I were to choose between public or profit, I think you would
Happily,
side
I
over the
did it.
people,
Absolutely.
right? And I'm proud of
Yeah,
your
sure.
legacy on that. So the triple bottom line mindset, right, that we're looking at it. Walk me through your views. I think this whole last 3 decades of this single dimensional views for corporation, where yes, we have vision and value systems, our mission statements are posted all over the buildings, but when it comes to the practice, we never practiced beyond those notes. Can we actually attain all these 3 things simultaneously? And what do you think was lacking then, and what do you think we'll need to understand that these are the key ingredients that's going to propel us to the future? We cannot just be one-dimensional.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful framework when you think about how those 3 Ps go together. And we all wake up as people. We depend on there being profit for us to have jobs and feed our families. And we're all part of a planet, which sometimes gives us cues for what the planet needs. And don't worry when people say we're destroying the planet will outlive us for sure. The question
Amen.
is whether we will save ourselves in the planetary context. And, to me, it's a balance between trust and not being naive. Trust in that we have to trust people to, it's the reason that communism didn't work, is it was too paternalistic and didn't trust people that if they had private enterprise and could become an entrepreneur, that they would always use that for bad. We need to harness that. In a state like California, I think we see it crystal clear. We have these stones that we've passed as legislation that are well-intentioned on environment and on labor and on, density of zoning in our cities. Each one a noble kind of stone, but when you put 50 of them in a backpack, it's impossible to move, and we can't build housing, and our schools need improvements, and our environmental laws have nothing to do about the environment, but often just a way to slow a project down and extort something from it. So there's that piece of trust that I think is really important. But you also can't completely trust human beings because we're human beings. Unchecked corporations who need to be focused on the bottom line will do everything to get to that bottom line. We've set it up for short-term profits, for leaders to get stock bonuses that year and not think about the 20-year horizon and their workers. Henry Ford, for all his flaws, wanted a marketplace of consumers and changes in production. Oftentimes people are like, I want to be a startup and out in 5 years and earn my mint. And there's so few people that can be those founders that can make that money and that over-concentration of wealth. You look at, a guy like Rockefeller, who was the first billionaire in this country. At his highest point, when people didn't think there could be a billionaire, if you adjust for inflation, that would be a $40 billion fortune that he had. He always denied he was a billionaire, but history showed he probably got a little bit above. Today, we were talking about the first trillionaire.
Absolutely.
The scale is way beyond the Gilded Age. It's way beyond that. And at a certain point, we can't be naive. And that's why it's important, whether it's with AI and what it could do, positively, but mostly on the negative side, whether it's looking at profits and how much is enough, or our responsibilities in an age of automation to when people don't have work in the very near future, how will we not have social unrest? And how do we prepare for that now? How do we disincentivize companies saying proudly, I got rid of 10,000 workers because now I have something automated or AI taking that? I don't fault moving towards efficiency, but if we don't plan as a society, a guaranteed basic income, or some of the things like our trades we were talking about here, becoming a plumber or something, we have a million jobs in the trades that we don't have people lined up to do because we're still going to need to build things. So we need to adopt and adapt to those moments, the best policies, and not be naive, but also be trusting enough.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think you and I spoke about it earlier about the human capital. I just came back from the trip from Texas. The founding, endowing donor, Randall Kendrick, has an amazing project in Texas, 33,000 acres, where we're building 3 cities size of San Francisco, 50 million square foot of advanced manufacturing logistics center, and power, water. You imagine this as actually a sub-country within the country with an intention of being carbon neutral, meaning at the end of the day, when everything is functioning, which is over the next couple of decades, it will be carbon neutral. But the vision is to be able to actually think 100 years ahead and say, can we do all of these things at the same time? If you're going to build something, can you really create something that is sustainable, circular, environmentally friendly, and creates the community where you can actually plan things when you have an opportunity to build ground up?
We hope you enjoyed another exciting episode of Supply Chain Demystified. Stay tuned for the next demystifying discussion on the supply chain. Visit uscsupplychain.com to stay up to date on all things supply chain.